Yep. So this morning we're in the beginning of Acts chapter 14 in the first 7 verses. So let me read the text and then we'll proceed from there. So Acts chapter 14 verses 1 to 7. Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews, with their rulers, to mistreat them and stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding countries, and there they continued to preach the gospel. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, relatively shorter passage, but just divides a bit nicer this way before we then move into them in Lystra specifically. So here, again, Luke is kind of zooming back out, as is the case with throughout Acts. It's zoom into a specific incident or story, zoom back out to the meta-narrative, zoom back in, zoom back out. So here is more, it's kind of zooming in and zooming out in the one sense. But we've moved on to Iconium, where on the maps that we had, basically, long story short, they've travelled southeast from Pisidian Antioch. I think probably about roughly kind of 70 to 80 kilometres, I think it is. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's roughly.
You're talking about Antioch in Pisidia, right?
That's the one, yep. So the one up in Pisidia, so not Antioch over in Syria.
Yep.
They're still on their journey here. So Pisidian Antioch, which we were in last time, they've then travelled basically south, roughly speaking southeast, to another major city, Iconium. Iconium was quite a wealthy city. It had been a Greek city for quite a while, but it had risen in prominence under particularly Augustus and the Roman Emperor. And then from those days forward, especially into the first century here, it became a full-fledged city as a designation in the greater region of Galatia, and was quite wealthy. And obviously, what that has, with a city and wealth brings prominent people, or is founded upon prominent people, either direction. And so they're not entering into some backwater here. They're entering into a notable and wealthy city. And so this is the details we get. So verse 1. Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. So again, same pattern that we've seen not only in chapter 13, but we've seen throughout the rest of kind of going back even to 12 and 11. But particularly here in 13 and now 14, this is the pattern. They first go into the city, they go and kind of beeline for the synagogue, which is the meeting place, obviously, of Jews and then kind of Gentile converts. And they speak to them first, and a great number of both Jews and Greeks, so both ethnicities, believed. They believed what they were hearing from the apostles.
So were the Greeks allowed in the synagogue?
Not well in the broader context of being allowed in the complex, in the kind of synagogue complex. They were subdivided. So men and women were subdivided in the synagogue anyway, and then Jew and anyone not a Jew was subdivided then again from that point. Yeah. If they had, it depends again. It also depends on what, like we had in previous weeks and other lessons in times past. It depends on what their status was as a Gentile. If they were a kind of full convert, if they'd been circumcised and had made pledges and etc., then there would be elements in which they would be allowed into the synagogue to that degree. If they were like if they were like the Ethiopian eunuch, there's obviously debate about the specifics of his identity. It's most likely that he's an ethnic Jew in Ethiopia, but either way, his being a eunuch would have precluded him based on the practices of those days. So that was kind of part of that story that we went back into chapter 7 or chapter 8, wherever it was. Cornelius, again, someone like Cornelius in chapter 10, who's kind of the first Gentile convert in that sense to Christianity, was described as a God-fearer, but we're not giving any indication that he was a full-fledged convert either, so he wouldn't have been in and amongst the synagogue like the other Jews would have. But this is the major kind of demarcation or the shift that occurs in the expansion of the greater covenant, this new covenant, in that these various little subdivisions are, at least broadly speaking, eliminated, right? This is the same apostle here who then goes on to say that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. It's not that those categories, it's not like the category man and woman doesn't exist anymore. It's not like in his day that he just snapped his fingers and the category of slave and master just magically disappeared. He wasn't that stupid. The point being, though, is that in Christ, that is to say in the church, in the kingdom of God, there is those designations don't make you like this class of citizen versus this class of citizen. Does that make sense? Yeah. It doesn't mean that there's not people who have roles. It doesn't mean that doesn't have to be qualifications for who's to be ministers in the church. All those things are just the natural way of order that we have in society. That's fine. But the designation of who is a greater person, or who's more worthy of this, or those kind of things, who can sit here and not sit here, and all those kind of things, those are gone because we now live under a greater covenant. Yeah, that's the point. And so this is why it's a big part of the reaction that we've seen not only in chapter 13, but we're going to see again here in this morning's passage. Because in verse 2, if you have a look there, but the unbelieving Jews, right? So the Jews he's distinguishing the Jews from verse 1 from the Jews in verse 2. So Jews who heard the gospel and then believed, right? They believed that Jesus is the Messiah, blah, blah, blah. He's now distinguishing from the other Jews that rejected that. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. Now, this is an interesting verse just in the wording, so let me just kind of dissect it a bit. Again, here, you can probably take, it's the same, so when we come across that word Jews in verse 2, it can be taken against Judaioi, it's that plural Jews, like we encountered in the last chapter. So it should be understood to be kind of the leading of the kind of Jewish leadership who've also rejected again in this city, most likely, at least the majority of them. There would have been other kind of Jewish congregants who would have rejected as well. So it's not just strictly, it's not going to be strictly the Jewish authorities, but again, the bulk of the Jewish authorities would reject in this case, almost certainly, given what then goes on. Because it's highly unlikely that the Jewish leadership believed, but then the congregants were the ones stirring up the Gentiles. They wouldn't carry that kind of authority or that ability to influence, unlikely. So again, unbelieving Jews here should be taken most likely just in context as the majority, if not all of the Jewish leadership, but probably at least the majority, as well as X percentage of the congregation. To whatever percentage, we're not sure. Probably a minority of the congregation, given the fact that we're told a great number of both Jews and Gentiles in verse 1 believed. So they believed what they were hearing, they believed the testimony of what these eyewitnesses of Christ had seen and were now telling them. But they stir up the Gentiles. And no, it's pretty interesting that their main goal is trying to stop the Greeks, trying to stop the Gentiles from following Christ. That's their main goal. Their main goal is to stop the Gentiles from following God, in this case.
Why would they do that? Why?
Because
I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, because they are, well, for a couple of reasons. One, because we're the people of God, not you barbarian Greeks. We're the ones who obey the law. We're the ones who follow the oral law. We're the ones who have the teachings, and we're the ones who listen to the rabbi. us. We're the chosen people. And it's a mentality of keeping Gentiles out, whereas the very opposite of what the New Testament calls the real Jews, like the Jews who actually recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, the command is actually to let the Gentiles in, not keep them out. So at the very end, it's you're seeing two antithetical worldviews kind of collide, like playing out. If that makes sense, yeah. You're seeing actual genuine inclusivity, not this kind of fake facade of inclusivity we have today. Genuine inclusivity that doesn't abandon order, that doesn't abandon morals, and doesn't abandon standards, right? But is inclusive in the sense that it doesn't matter at all how far you have fallen away from God. The fundamental premise is that everyone can be restored by God. No one has far surpassed what God is capable of restoring and redeeming and reconciling, right? So that's genuine inclusivity, right? That God is not a respecter of persons. He doesn't value one person because they're smarter than another.
Or
one ethnic over another. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't. God doesn't respect. Like, let's just take. Like, I know it sounds mildly biased because it's also my ancestry, but I think it's a pretty almost self-evident fact. The British Isles, and particularly Great Britain as an island, has had a very long-standing history of Christianity that goes all the way back to, I mean, literally the 50s AD. That goes back 2,000 years. Its track record of how it's conducted itself in regards to the Christian faith is also, on the whole, very, very good. That doesn't magically make the British or anyone descended from them somehow like this super class of Christians.
Like they think they are.
like the kind of times, yeah, you're right. It doesn't make the idea that God favours British. I know it seems like trivial to say this, but I'm just trying to use an obvious example, right? The idea that God favours British Christians over Russian Christians is not true, and probably usually something worth remembering when we start talking about geopolitics, because you have Christians in Russia and Ukraine. So I just want to talk about that little hotbed for a moment.
Really.
And are being knocked for six, which is why the blind support. And I mean that just literally just the blind, no thinking, no critical analysis, no nuance, the blind support for this side over that side. Why don't you go see what the Ukrainian government's doing to the Christians? Why don't you go see what they're doing? They're arresting priests. They're literally they're shutting down Ukrainian Orthodox churches that breathe within 3 feet of a Russian, that have any supposed connection to Russia without understanding that Ukraine is to Russia what Canada is to America, what New Zealand is to Australia, like the ethnic siblings.
It's insane.
Yeah, they've destroyed. They're shutting down entire denominations. They're destroying churches. They're arresting ministers and priests like me. But you'll blindly support these guys. Why? Yeah, so I'm saying no critical thinking, right? So the idea that God favors Ukrainian Christians over Russian Christians, you might want to rethink your theology. Nonsense. That's what I mean, right? And it's not even. It's because God is so much greater and higher than we are. The concept of Him having a favoritism of this over that diminishes His divine infinitude. It reduces Him down to. It logically reduces Him down to the level of petty human difference. Do you know what I mean? That's why. So it's an actual ontological issue when you treat it that way. And so you're seeing this kind of collide, right? Their goal is keep the Gentiles out, where the apostles are specifically here to bring the Gentiles in. Right? They're here to bring the Greeks in, right? The Jews are trying to keep the Greeks out. Right? So two antithetical principles about what on earth even constitutes the kingdom of God, right? And they do so by an interesting word. Again, can be translated a couple of different ways in English because there's no real direct translation. But ekakosein, either will generally be translated as poisoned or embittered. What does KJV have?
I've got their minds evil affected, and then literally their souls bitter or angry.
Yeah, that's all perfectly fine. Yeah,
against the brethren.
Yeah, minds can also be translated. So it's the word psyche in Greek, which is where we get the word psyche in English.
Right.
So like psychology. So psyche or psyche means the soul. It can also be understood to mean the mind as well. And so mind not meaning just like literally the brain in the skull. I mean like the mind, the soul, the personhood. Yep. So poisoning or embittering, or the word ekakosan, kakos is the Greek word for evil.
Yeah,
which is why a trend. Yeah, so it's often translated in the figurative sense of poison. It's like it's because evil is often envisioned like poison in ancient literature, and this is no exception. Evil being like something which poisons the soul, right? It's like a poison. It's like a cancer. It's like it spreads and it corrupts everything. That's what evil is envisioned like. It's one of the many ways in which evil is kind of analogized, right, as an analogy. Things like darkness, obviously, of course, corruption, decay. It's often compared to like fire or like rubbish and things that like burn and blah. But poison's one of those images as well. Poison or bitterness, that kind of imagery. So here he's using kind of poetic language, but he's using it in a way that would be that's common in ancient literature. Stirring up the Gentiles, turning them this way and that way, like basically trying to manipulate them into disobedience, is the premise there of stirring up, right? And stirring them up by poisoning their minds or their souls against the brother, in other words, like Paul and Barnabas, etc. Right?
Were they brothers, actually brothers?
No, so when it says brothers in these contexts, it's using it in like the terms like brotherhood kind of thing. Yeah. And so they're not literally brothers, but kind of the terminology that's used in the Book of Acts and other places in the New Testament is the concept of how Christians refer to each other as brothers and sisters in the faith.
The brethren of the believers.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And here it's kind of more this specific group of Paul and Barnabas and this group that's traveling along with Paul. Yeah. And so that's what they're doing. The unbelieving Jews are trying to keep them out. They're trying to do whatever they can to dissuade them from actually following Christ as the Messiah. And so they're basically, if I was to use the wording that's used here, poison their minds, they are literally trying to poison the well, as that phrase goes. And so they would be slandering, they would be doing all manner of, again, we're not specifically told in the literal sense how they did that, because again, Luke has kind of zoomed back out to the broader picture here. But you would imagine it would be slanderous, it would be saying that they're this, they're that, they're not trustworthy, they're making up half-truths, lies, anything else in between, right? So slander. So again, but that speaks to the context of where the majority of the Jews were at this point. They're concerned with the ethnic purity, so to speak, of who's in the covenant, and so they're trying to, we're the ones who obey the law, and we're the ones who uphold the covenant and the rituals and and then don't give second thought to the fact that slander and lies are completely immoral. But they do it anyway. You know what I mean? Like, so the hypocrisy is something which is, you see it in the Gospels, the fact that the Jewish leadership are hypocrites left, right, and centre because they speak one side out of this mouth and the other side out of this. They focus heavily on this part of the law and then completely ignore these ones that don't suit them. Hypocrisy goes all the way. This age in which they're in is just, the defining word is hypocrisy.
But some things never change, right?
Yeah. Hypocrisy has not been rid from the earth yet, and so we're got a long way to go. So verse 3. So they remained for a long time. They, as in the group, they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace by granting signs and wonders be done by their hands. So they weren't dissuaded by the kind of propagandistic attacks that were coming their way. They remained for a long time. Again, we're not told specifically, but they remained for more than just 1 week or something like that. They remained for a while. They weren't dissuaded. They spoke boldly, so they spoke confidently and they spoke courageously in the face of persecution. And the Lord bore witness. Again, notice it's not just them. It's God bearing witness to the word of his grace, right? His grace unto all people, Jew and Gentile. And this was accompanied or kind of confirmed by these signs and wonders, which we've encountered in previous times in Acts. And again, the purpose, it's not, we've covered before, and so it's a bit of catch up, but during this particular time period in which Christ has come, in which the message is kind of getting off the ground of who he was and what he did, you had, not for the first time, because you can go back into the Old Testament and find them, of course, as we've covered before, but you have these kinds of miraculous signs like Jesus had done, right? Healing someone with leprosy, healing someone with blindness, etc., things like that, right? Which are not to be expected as just like the standard or the norm, because they're not even the standard or the norm throughout the Bible. They occur during these kind of isolated, kind of climactic periods, of which this is one of them. It's done for a couple of reasons, as we explained before. It's partly, in fact, because the Jews, well, both Jews and Gentiles, particularly the Jews, had a particular fascination with the concept that if this person did miracles, it was a confirmation that their message was from God. It's not terribly illogical. If we saw someone walking on water today, we'd probably pay attention to it. We'd go, well, that's not normal. So it's fairly straightforward. It's also pointing to the rational concept of, again, if this person is able to, again, like Christ walking on water, if he is God, there's nothing at all irrational about Christ walking on water, because after all, he's God and he formed it out of nothing, and walking upon it is an infinitely easier task than creating the atomic structure of water. So it's logically straightforward when the premise is that he is God. And so the accompanying of signs and wonders, again, we don't see them today. We're not expected to see them today. We're told that throughout the New Testament. But nonetheless, and you're told that more specifically when you zoom out to the rest of the Bible and you see that these are kind of isolated periods that accompany a message being brought to testify to its validity.
When God is doing a new thing. Yeah,
basically. And this is, again, we obviously had Easter on the weekend. Again, the resurrection does many things, but part of it is the confirmation of the validity of the crucifixion and what it achieved, as well as testifying more broadly to the fact that he has conquered death and that he is God. And this again has been testified. I've never seen anybody raised from the dead. I don't expect to see anybody raised from the dead, and I shouldn't, and nor should we in terms of in this life. But I can read historical accounts and figure out this must have happened, because it's vastly more likely that it did happen as opposed to all the other hypotheses. Again, no different when it says here, like in verse 3, that they did signs and wonders. No one in their day denied that they did it. I mean, even the Jewish leadership didn't deny that they did these things. They just came up with other excuses like, well, they must be doing magic, or they must be devil worshippers, and like 1,000 other different excuses. So not even their enemies didn't deny that they were doing these things. If their enemies didn't deny that they were doing these things, it's probably a pretty good indication that they were doing these things. Just like with Christ and his resurrection, this whole thing could have been stamped out if the Jews had just gone to the tomb and said, well, here's his body. But his body wasn't there. And they knew that, and that's why the Jews never argued that his body wasn't there. They had to come up with other excuses as to, well, it must have been stolen. And so somehow these fishermen got through 20 or 30 heavily armed and trained warriors guarding a tomb somehow, which seems exorbitantly unlikely, especially when you consider the fact that 500 people saw him raised from the dead. And how do you explain 500 people seeing someone raised from the dead if that didn't happen? That's where the excuses then just kind of get rolled out that don't make sense. Mass hallucination, which we've never seen before. There's no scientific or clinical evidence of, all these kinds of things. So they did signs and wonders. Again, not because they were magicians, not because they had some like intrinsic power, but it was God working through them. And that's been the case that we've seen before. And it testifies, it, as the middle of that verse 3 says, it bears witness to the word that they're proclaiming. Okay. Verse 4. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. Right, so this is here, Luke is just kind of setting the context of kind of what's going on as this is all unfolding. City itself was divided. And you assume, by the way, that when it talks about some people in the city, it's talking about Jews and Gentiles. So the Jews and Gentiles themselves were divided. There were Jews who believed, Jews who did not believe. There were Gentiles who did believe, Gentiles who did not believe. And hence they were saying some sided with the Jews. Right, in this case, Judeo probably is definitely referring to the leadership. Some sided with the Jewish leadership and some sided with the apostles. Verse 5, when an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and they fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. So their response that comes, so they, I mean the city here in this context, the response then comes that they are trying to then basically petition and attempt to petition the rulers of the city. So now they're appealing to the Roman authorities, specifically, to then stone them to death. This would have been, again, you can see there's a key detail in here that tells you who's driving this and who's kind of being swept up in like the mob-like kind of fashion here. And it comes with the detail of Luke highlighting the detail that they were calling for the apostles to be stoned. Right? Stoning is a Jewish practice, A, and B, it was done primarily for blasphemy, among many other crimes, but blasphemy was one of the ones in which that occurred. So it doesn't make sense for this to have been led by the Gentiles, who for starters don't stone people. They kill you other ways like crucifixion, beheading, etc. So, and the crime here that must have been warranting only really makes sense for, wasn't murder, it wasn't other things like that, it would obviously must have been blasphemy. So you can see the context of what's being called for, and that tells you who's driving it. It's clearly the Jewish leadership, which makes sense of what we saw back up in verse 2. Right? But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their mind against the Christians. Right?
It had to be the leadership, otherwise, because the others wouldn't have had any, real...
Couldn't throw their weight around. Yeah, that's what I was trying to highlight earlier. Yeah, that they didn't have the gravitas to be able to pull off convincing the Greek or Roman citizens, especially Greek or Roman leadership, like the actual Roman authorities themselves, to be able to then actually take like kind of judicial or executive action. Yeah, and so they stir up the Jews and other kind of unbelieving Jewish congregants, and to get the rulers to mistreat them and to stone them. Again, you can see it's the Jewish push that's driving this. Not solely because they're whipping up a mob here like there's no tomorrow, but it's clear that concept of stoning them, namely for blasphemy, that's a Jewish idea. But in verse 6, the Christians, right, the Paul and the others, they learn of it, right? So they somehow find out. They somehow find out about the plot. Again, we're not told who, we're not told how. Could have happened in a number of ways, but perhaps someone involved in the kind of officium or the bureaucracy of the city was sympathetic for one reason or another. Perhaps some, going back up to verse 1, the great number of both Jews and Greeks that believed. Perhaps one of those Greeks or a number of those Greeks worked for the government, right? And they then hear about the plot, and then they tell. It could happen in a number of ways. We're not specifically told, but I dare suspect that this is one of those kind of examples that we have throughout Acts. We've encountered them before and more broadly also the New Testament and the rest of the Bible of the unsung hero. we've encountered people like that before, but and we will again. But the people who are not ever referenced by name, but someone must have said something. Someone, you know what I mean? Like they didn't just magically. It's not like they were just walking down the road and they magically happened to find like a note on the ground. That's unlikely. It's more unlikely, at least, than someone leaking that information to them. So I suspect, again, it's no way of proving it, but I suspect logically that this is another case of an unsung hero kind of encounter here. So verse 6, they learn of it. They then fled to Lystra and Derbe. So this is not meant to be taken as like they fled. These are two different cities. And so when you have your map, because we'll move on to Lystra next, if you read forward there from verse 8 onward. And so Luke has zoomed out here because Lystra and Derbe are two different cities. So they have to head from Iconium, they have to head south to Lystra, and then Derbe is west. East, I should say, east of Lystra. And so he's just zooming out to, here's what they did next, like in the next chapter of this story type of thing. And so they fled to Lystra, which were cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country, and there they continued to preach the gospel. So verse 6 and 7 is a zoom out. That's what I was referencing earlier. We had zoomed into Iconium, now we've zoomed back out in verse 6 and 7. Really, I mean, the stuff about Lystra and Derbe we'll get onto as we go through the rest of this chapter. So I'll leave that kind of for those portions. But the only other thing really to finish on here that's worth noting at least is, one, they were not dissuaded from their duty. And so we get that in verse 7, right? They continue to preach the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ to both the Jews and the Gentiles, right? To Jews and Greeks. The other point, perhaps worth mentioning as well, a bit of a meta-narrative point, is that they fled. Right? So when persecution came upon them in Iconium, they went, we need to get the heck out of Dodge, right? And they flee to another city. Obviously, Paul had done this many, many years ago now, nearly a decade ago now, in Damascus. Obviously, when he converted to Christ, and then the Jews in that city found out, they wanted to try and kill him. Then they hunted him, and then the Christians helped him escape out over the city walls. When persecution comes, there's nothing at all, and I mean life-threatening persecution, there's nothing dishonourable about making the obvious, logical, strategic decision to flee that place. Nowhere are we commanded to, even if we have a proverbial escape route, to submit to being murdered, right? We find times where it's really obvious that without just kind of slaughtering everyone, I'm not getting out of this, that we find then that martyrdom is very much an honourable thing. And obviously there's been, across the last 2,000 years, I mean, there's been hundreds of millions of martyrs, right? But it's certainly around the world at this point. But fleeing is not at all like something that's not a very obvious option. The Church of Jerusalem did this, when we fast forward, obviously it's not covered in the book of Acts, but we know historically from the accounts of Josephus, who was an eyewitness and a historian in the first century, that just before the Roman army surrounds Jerusalem during the Jewish-Roman War, the Christians in Jerusalem flee to the hills in the east. So they remembered what Christ had said back in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Matthew 24, that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, to use Luke's wording, flee to the east. And so they do that. It tells them, don't run around gathering your belongings. You're about to get surrounded and everyone is going to die. Which is exactly what happened, because it was a horrifically bad siege and a war. And so they flee Jerusalem and they escape that massive war and that tribulation that befell that city and that judgment.
So that was around the time the temple was destroyed? Yes,
that's what I'm talking about, yep. So the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, this judgment that Jesus had said would happen, for their rejection and for their crucifixion of him, for the fact that they had killed so many of God's people throughout the ages, the fact that they continue to kill God's people in this time. We've already had Christians killed. We've already had thousands of Christians killed at this. Well, that's right, at least hundreds of Christians killed by this point. 10 years ish on, or 15 years on rather. By the time we get to the end of the first century, we've probably had maybe nearly 10,000 killed at least. Jewish and Roman authorities alike, kind of between the both of them. But yes, no, when that happened, and I won't, I've said I want to devolve into the history of we'll cover that in our church history classes when they come back online in a couple of weeks. But when they flee Jerusalem, it's this tiny window that they get just before the Roman army surrounds the city and begins the siege, which then goes on for months and months and months. And they escape safely, but obviously everyone in Jerusalem is then wiped out through battle, through mainly from famine and pestilence and disease and everything else that the New Testament says was going to happen, and that befell them. But so fleeing is not like it's not a cowardly option at all. It's just strategic. It would be no different than an army making a tactical retreat in warfare. It's not. You're not cowards for retreating to a safer position. It's just a strategic move. There are places where, coming down the pike, most likely, outside of an absolute miracle, there are places in the West that Christians are going to logically have to retreat from. I would, this is a very broad argument, so it's not to be taken as like a bona fide, kind of 100%, take it with a big grain of salt. There are already parts of the West which are almost worth retreating out of. Certainly cities like Los Angeles, New York, Melbourne, at least those three in the West are you're not complete.
London?
London still has some good soil, to use that kind of metaphor there, definitely.
Okay.
But certainly at least those three of Los Angeles, New York City and Melbourne are very overtly, even San Francisco I'd probably put in that bat as well. Those four cities are pretty much almost on the point where you are not 100% wasting your time, right? Because doing charitable things is never a waste of time per se. But you are certainly to a broad degree, you might as well be talking to a brick wall. Right?
Isn't Sydney coming up close?
Sydney's getting there. It's certainly not quite at the level of other places, but it's made a bit of a leap. It's made a bit of a leap in a bound, certainly in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Is that the people who are Christians, or the people who are putting forward the gospel?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what we're finding in those cities is you have this kind of confluence of factors. Like if I just take Los Angeles as kind of the arch example of this. Los Angeles as a city is horrifically mismanaged, has not just like dumb kind of political policies, but things that are counterintuitive and counterproductive to human flourishing. It has willful neglect of things that should be otherwise taken care of. It has a humongous homeless problem, and has a humongous crime problem, all those other various things, which don't mean, that's not the reason I'm talking about leaving. The issue is though, is that when we're trying as Christians to present the gospel, right, and the good news of salvation in Christ, you have times where it's like this, right? They've come into a city they've never been to before, and they're met with quite a sizable proportion of people that are receptive to it. They're actually willing to listen. They're willing to use the logic that every one of us has been given. They're willing to use their brains and to listen and to actually consider and to be persuaded. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. There are other times where they'll go into places and they're practically met with just nothing but chaos. They're met with zero intent to listen, zero desire to know God, zero desire to actually find out what is the truth about pretty much anything. And they're just met with barbarism or just met with flat out rejection, and then on the turn of that, persecution, right? This is kind of like at least a portion of this is a snapshot of it, right? So certainly at least the Jewish leadership weren't having a bar of it. They didn't want to listen. They didn't want to consider. They didn't want to think, oh, are these guys actually saying what's true? Can we actually go and look? How about we take what they're saying and let's compare it to what's already been written? Like things that are just logical, right? An unwillingness to do that across the board. The kind of analogy that Jesus himself used, he gives a kind of a parable or an analogy to help us kind of get the picture. It's like having seed and then tossing some of it on like nice fertile soil where it's obviously going to grow a nice crop, right? But then there's other type where you're just throwing it basically on concrete. You can throw seeds on concrete all day long. Nothing's going to happen. Yeah, because there's no receptiveness to it. There's no, the term that the Bible uses for it is hardness of heart, right? Being hardened, like a rock, like not willing to.
Have they not also been blinded?
Yeah, well, they blinded themselves. Yeah, that's what it does. That's why evil's kind of used. That's the type. We've obviously seen evil being used in the sense of like poison in this text, but that's where the imagery of evil being like darkness, that's where that comes up, right? So in darkness, you can't see. You're having to like start. There's no order. You can't see clearly, right? This is the kind of metaphoric imagery of like light versus darkness, right? And when you live in evil, when you do evil things, when you willfully believe lies or half truths, etc., 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 you're like someone stumbling around in a pitch black room. You can't see clearly. You can't walk clearly. You can't direct yourself clearly, right? It's chaos. You're stumbling around. You're tripping over a chair. That's what it's like. And so that's the kind of imagery that the Bible uses trying to communicate these kind of principles to us, right? And when you then try and live in that setting and you just try to live your normal life in a pitch black room, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And all that does, right, you take that from the individual level and then you multiply that out to the civilizational level, and that's where things become truly destructive. Because imagine an entire society, again, when I say entire, I don't mean like literally every person, but I mean like the structure, the institutions, et cetera, right? And at least the bulk of the people. You then try to run a society like a man stumbling around a pitch black room, that has big real world consequences to it. Lies are associated with darkness, truth with light, because when it is in light, you can see the way forward, you can see there's the table, there's the kitchen, I can make the food, I can actually prepare food without chopping my fingers off, I can make a tea without boiling my hands, right? The bad things, that's why it's good, it's very good imagery, but that's why it's been used for thousands of years, because it's kind of, human beings have understood it, right? And so when you find, and so that imagery on the concept of communicating truth to someone, if they're like concrete, or they're like asphalt, they're like the road, right? You can throw seed on it all day long. Nothing's going to happen, right? You stop throwing seed on concrete, throw it on fertile soil, right? That's willing to actually listen, that's willing to use their brain, that's willing to think rationally, that's willing to actually consider, but not even just consider just in a generic sense, but consider honestly. Like actually be willing to be demonstrated that, maybe my beliefs were wrong. Maybe am I actually willing to abandon X, whatever I have to do, abandon this view if it's demonstrated that it's wrong. But see, what that requires is humility, right? You know what I'm saying?
And this is what they lack.
Yeah, correct. Yes, yes. Anyone who inherently doesn't desire to submit to truth is ultimately an issue, not so much with truth and lies. It's really, well, that is the surface level issue. The deeper level issue, though, is humility, or conversely, pride. Right, pride. That's why pride is held in the Bible to be kind of the arch sin, the sin that begets other sins, because it's through pride that we're unwilling to change in the face of lies, for example, or unwilling to change in regards to behaviours and habits that are sinful or evil. It all, again, there's the surface level issues, which are definitely issues in their own right, but they trace themselves back. It's like all roads lead to Rome. Rome in this case is pride, right? You know what I mean? Augustine had a very poignant way of phrasing this, the Christian theologian back in the 5th century. He used the Latin term incurvatus in se, which means curved in on oneself. That pride is like being curved in on yourself, where everything is focused inward and your desires are focused internally. And so therefore, instead of being focused outward, not only outward on fellow men, but also upward and outward on God, right? You're focused inward. So the self, the ego, in that literal sense in the Greek terminology, the ego, the self, becomes the primary purpose for all things. And so then what you do in life, it is all run through the measure or the metric of what's best for me, right? At times, where we're just talking about truth and lies then, right? Light and darkness, to keep that going, the changing, submitting to truth and realizing that you were wrong is more difficult, at least in the immediate sense, than just kind of holding on to lies. It's a lot more comfortable to just hold on to a lie, right? Because it means that A, I don't have to admit that I was wrong. B, I don't have to submit to someone else who might be telling. So it might be someone else that's telling me that something that's true, and so it means now that acknowledging to someone's face that they're right and I'm wrong. See, that's all pride. That's all to do. That entire action is to do with pride, yeah. And so that's what it ends up becoming. That's what pride does. It's why Dante in Dante's Inferno, this kind of classical Renaissance work of divine comedy and tragedy, when he gets down to the ninth circle of hell, he finds, instead of the kind of other common imagery of fire, he actually finds the other in his writing there. The image that's presented is actually a very icy, cold lake, frozen lake, and you have a number of figures in there, but primarily you have in the center of that frozen lake, which is good because at the same time that hell and evil is described like fire, it's also described as being like outer darkness, right? So that's why it's not to be taken, it's imagery, it's not to be taken as like a blunt, literal kind of thing. Outer darkness is almost reminiscent of almost like the extent of the universe or of space, where it's bitterly cold. There's no outer darkness, there's no light. That means it's by definition cold. And that's the imagery he picks up on in the Inferno. And in it you have Satan in this grotesque visage with bat wings and blackened skin because of what pride has done to him. And he's half frozen in the lake. And so his like torso and these gigantic bat wings that he's developed are constantly flapping and trying to get out of the icy lake, but all it's doing is making everything else colder around him. And he's got three grotesque, kind of distorted faces, almost like a false trinity, right? Because of his desire to become like God, but he can't. And that's the arch pride. Again, the whole story of Satan as a figure begins with pride. It begins with him trying to become like God, and then trying to convince man to become like God. And so this imagery of pride is like kind of centered upon when in Dante's Inferno. It's a very, very, very good image. And of not just things metaphorically, but also then tying into the kind of scriptural perspective that's given of what pride does. And so tying it all back together with the very original point here of fleeing. Fleeing is a perfectly legitimate option to take, because all it's doing is realizing that for one reason or another, God is calling us to go somewhere else, right? We come across this later, but they were originally going to go up into Macedon, which is in northern Greece. Up into Macedonia, which was the historic kingdom that Alexander the Great was from. That was he was the king of Macedon. And God tells them no, go down into Greece, don't go up. Why? Well, not really specifically. Like, we're not told in any grand sense why. For God's purposes. I mean, Macedonia ended up becoming Christian later on, but why not then? It's entirely possible because the people in that city were just not going to be receptive to it, right? And so God, in His sovereignty, tells them to go elsewhere for now, right? We're not told, but the point being is that there are times where if someone's not, if the people are not receptive to it, you don't just kind of keep hammering it. You are wasting time. You're throwing seed upon asphalt. There's been times where that's been the case. Again, you can find numerous historical accounts of Christian missionaries going to a new land to do good, and they get absolutely annihilated by the people there. Cool. You then find other examples, which are equally as numerous, of Christian missionaries arriving in, say, for example, South America, and they're met almost practically on the shores by the entire tribe or the entire town or the entire city, whatever the context is, and their chief or their warlord or their leader says, "Are you the ones that have been sent to us?" Like, we have historical accounts of that are from those people, because God had clearly been preparing these people for the... So, like, you have a difficult time explaining that outside of the actual substance of what's being said. Like, how do you explain? Are you the ones that have been sent to us? Like, it's not, these are people in South America and these are people in Europe who've never met each other, they don't even know each other. How do you don't explain that without, like, it doesn't make sense. And so you find both extremes. So yeah, the West is going to find, Christians in the West are going to find themselves at a point over the coming decades where that will be the case, where retreat from these certain cities is just going to be the only logical option left. Because you can do as much charitable good as you want, it doesn't matter when they're throwing you all in prison. So that's something that'll have to be considered more weightily by Christians as they kind of actually wake up to what on earth is going on around them. Unfortunately, too many are currently kind of living in a bit of a twilight zone of not really being comfortable with acknowledging yet that things are kind of falling apart around them. But that's another issue entirely. So let me finish there. Are there any other further questions or anything else about this morning's passage?
How would they travel?
Here, I mean, look, certainly when they're on the land, they're either going to be doing a lot of walking, or they'll be travelling a number of different ways. Certainly, we see throughout the rest of the book of Acts, they use all kinds of modes of transport. Horseback would be a logical option. Getting a ride with another caravan, so another group of people travelling, is an option as well. Walking, people did plenty of walking, so a lot of these scenarios they may very well have walked, and then they're stopping off at different towns or villages along the way. Walk this mount this day, walk a mount another day, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, when they've been travelling through, they've already travelled via ship, which was easily the kind of naval transport was like the flying of the ancient world. It's how you got between places quickly. And so when they travelled from Antioch to Cyprus, and then Cyprus up into Perga, where they landed, that's all obviously by ship. But then different modes of transport are used, as I said, walking, horseback.
They might be in a hurry.
Yes. Certainly in this scenario, yeah, they would have been trying to get out of Dodge pretty quickly. So what mode of transport here specifically, we're not kind of told. But broadly speaking, they would utilise a number of different modes of transport.
Lots of support from people who...
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and they had support from people getting them out of places. But yeah, certainly it depends on the context. Depends on the landscape. Depends on a bunch of things. So yes, travelling via foot, travelling via horseback, travelling via cart, all kinds of different things. Yeah. So, yeah. Alrighty. Thank you.
Okay.
So, so as I mentioned, we'll pick up in 3 weeks' time. It's going to be the first week in May, which when we're back. So not on the next 2 weeks, and then on the third week. Okay. So, good day.